Welcome to the Neubauer Collegium for Culture and Society's Director's Lecture. I am Jonathan Lear, the Roman Family Director. And today we shall hear from Martin Wolf, the Chief Economics Commentator at the Financial Times, on the topic, The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. We will then have an open conversation with Marianne Bertrand, Elizabeth Chatterjee, John Levy, Kenneth Pomerantz, and Gabriel Winant, all members of the University of Chicago faculty. And we will also take questions from the audience. I shall let the others talk about economics. I want to spend a moment talking about journalism. It seems to me that the very possibility of robust democracy depends on its containing excellent journalism within it. And the reason is simple. If citizens are to be the basis of decision-making, they need to be well informed. I'm confident that if Aristotle were to write today, at a time when democracies are so much larger in geography and population than anything he experienced, he would add a chapter on journalism to his politics. Journalist ought to be one of the most honored roles in political life, for it is certainly one of the most important. There is something extraordinary about the way meaning and time meet in a journalist's job. On the one hand, it's internal to meaning that the meaning of events, we really only come to understand them later when we look back from a wider context. But that's just it. The journalist's job is to capture the meaning of an unfolding event right now against a fast approaching deadline and present that meaning to a wide audience who both want and need to understand the world they live in. There's something masterful about getting things right enough for the moment. And there's also, if I may say, an erotic element in journalism. Some of you, but maybe not all of you, know Plato's Symposium. The priestess there, Diotima, tells the young Socrates that Eros is not a god, but rather a messenger between gods and humans. Eros's job is to travel to the gods and tell them what humans want, and then return back and tell us in a language we can understand what the gods have to say. In Martin Wolf's case, the journalist commentator is someone who visits the economists and then returns to explain it to ordinary citizens who may not understand but do need to know, if that is, there is to be a real democracy. Of course, journalism as we know it has always had a propagandistic underbelly, and ironically, that too is part of a robust democracy. But what concerns me is a decline in the standards of excellence in the newspapers in the United States that take themselves to be standards of excellence. A friend of mine, in a mid-pandemic conversation, asked me how one prevents another Holocaust. Part of my answer is to promote and insist upon the highest standards of journalism. It is in this context that I have invited Martin Wolf to join us at the Neubauer Collegium. In my opinion, Martin Wolf is an exemplar of journalism and comment as a serious political calling, holding himself to the highest standards, both in understanding a complex and crucially important subject matter, in this case, economics, and in explaining it to a wider audience of non-expert citizens. And part of his excellence consists in the fact that he does not talk down to his audience. He creates a serious readership with his generous assumption that we readers want to hold ourselves to serious standards in order to be informed citizens. I have asked our faculty colleagues to join in conversation. While they all come from the academic world, they share a commitment to make their research accessible to a wider world of citizens who want to be informed. Martin Wolf is associate editor at the Financial Times, and as I said, its chief economics commentator. He has received many awards, including the Overseas Press Club of America's Prize for Best Commentary on International News in any medium. And although I am a staunch anti-royalist, I will hold myself to a certain standard of reporting and tell you that he is also a commander of the Order of the British Empire. I also want to report that he is an enormously good sport. In the original invitation, I of course assumed that he would be our guest here. But in the pandemic world, he is staying up late after a long day in London so that we can meet at our regular time in Chicago. Now, we are all by now somewhat used to meeting on Zoom, so I hope you will do what you need to do to join me in extending a warm welcome to Martin Wolf, who will speak to us today on the topic, the crisis of democratic capitalism.
Okay. First of all, it's, I hope I'm supposed to speak now. It's a great pleasure to be with you. When anybody tells me or tells the audience that that I'm a CB, a commander of the British Empire, I always like to comment that it shows whatever else the British have lost in the last century or so, they haven't yet lost their sense of humor. Since by now, although I think it's revived a bit recently, most people have actually forgotten we ever had an empire. I was also actually intrigued when Jonathan was referring to the calling of the journalist as erotic. I misheard him for a second and I thought he said neurotic, which would actually do just as well for this purpose. So it's an immense pleasure to be with you. And I'm going to offer a small presentation, but before I do, let me just say what this is about. I'm coming to the end of writing a book, which is called The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. I started it 4 or 5 years ago. It's certainly the most ambitious thing I've ever done. It goes well beyond economics and almost certainly well beyond my competence. Since it stretches into philosophy, politics in many different ways. But I thought, well, there probably isn't anyone nowadays who's really competent to do this sort of thing. We don't have many people around like Adam Smith anymore. And the subjects are so important. The relations between our political and economic systems are so important that I felt it was reasonable to try to do this and to raise some questions about how we got to where we are, how we got to where we are, and what we can do about it. And I only started this because I felt that our system was falling apart, that the stresses within it were becoming enormous. I needed to understand why, what had gone wrong in what I'd believed myself. And I've got many commentaries in the book on all this, and what could be done about it. Now, the book is already not quite finished, about 130,000 words of real text, which is too much, as my publisher will say. And I can do no more than provide the most simple summary of my ideas, which are very crude. But in essence, I think what I'm saying is that in the middle of the 20th century, after the catastrophes of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, or you can go back further, we created what might be called, in different ways, in different countries, the social democratic consensus. And for various, actually quite understandable reasons, this fell apart. And for a very long time, that didn't seem to be mortal for our political system, but more recently, it looks as though we have lost the sense we're part of a shared political endeavor, that we are citizens. We're not just consumers, we are citizens. And that brought me back to where, in a sense, I started, because before I became an economist, I did a degree in economics and a graduate degree in economics at Oxford, and then spent most of my life as an economist. I read classics at Oxford and then PPE, politics, philosophy, and economics. And I was really far more interested in philosophy and history than in economics, but I didn't really think either was going to be a satisfactory profession. So I've gone back to my roots in a however amateurish a way. So with that, let me just do my presentation. I hope it will work. And I will now show my little presentation. It's quite short, and I hope at least it gives an outline of my ideas. I should stress, I changed the title back to Saving Democratic Capitalism because the crisis just sounded so depressing, but the basic material is the same. So I've got a couple of quotations at the beginning. One is, I think, newer to many people. The other is pretty cliche, but it's one of those cliches that's so useful. I can't think of a better way of doing it. So this is a quotation, since Jonathan mentioned it, from, sorry, let me see if I can find a way to go back. Yes, from Aristotle, The Politics. And it turned out to be incredibly relevant to when I read through The Politics again, which is I hadn't done for 50 years, it seemed incredibly relevant to my argument, which is it is clear then that the best partnership in a state, by which he meant obviously a polis, a city-state, is one which operates through the middle people, by which he meant essentially the middle class. And also that those states in which the middle element is large and stronger, if possible, than the other two, by which he meant the oligarchs, the very wealthy on the one hand and the poor on the other, or at any rate stronger than either of them alone, have every chance of having a well-run, stable political constitution. And I think this is very consistent with both our thinking and our experience historically. And the second quote is, of course, very famous, and it's from Hemingway. And it was my attempt to explain how we suddenly reached what seemed to be states of political crisis in Western countries that we'd always thought of as having highly consolidated, highly stable democracies like the US or the UK. And the quote goes, "How did you go bankrupt? Two ways, gradually, then suddenly." In other words, after the financial crisis and after the emergence of the sort of politics we've seen in the US and UK, particularly in the last decade, it seemed quite suddenly that a political system that had looked stable and robust with shared values and attitudes had actually fallen apart in quite profound ways, raising pretty big questions. And that's, of course, from Hemingway. So what I'm going to do in my presentation is cover the following topics. I'm going to talk about the fragility of democratic capitalism, the combination of, by capitalism, I mean simply the market economy with, of course, a market-based financial system as part of it. But I don't want to get into whether this is the same thing as Marx believed or any of that, though I have some of that in the book. And that with democracy, by which for this purposes, I mean universal suffrage, representative democracy, which is, of course, our contemporary version, though I discuss other versions, including the idea of direct democracy and sortition, lots, choosing representatives by lots. I do discuss that in one chapter, but I'm not going to go into that further here. So that's the first subject. And then I'm going to talk about what is now called the democratic recession and how to think about that. And that's a term that comes in particular from Larry Diamond, who of Stanford, who's, I suppose, one of the world's leading, if not the world's leading scholars, academic scholars of democracy and its condition. Then I'm going to talk about what's been happening to the high-income democracies within that global context. And then I'm going to talk about renewing democratic capitalism with a few ideas on what we might think about this. And there's a brief conclusion. Okay. here a bit of potted history, which is, I think, pretty obvious, as I will be showing you in a moment. If you look at the sort of standard databases of democracy in terms of systems in which there is a wide franchise, not a universal franchise until really the late 20th or the late 19th or early 20th centuries, but a wide franchise in which there are regular elections and the government is chosen by, as a result of those elections, or the government or governments in the federal state are chosen as a result of those elections, that essentially such systems really didn't exist in 1800 at all. There weren't any. There were a few that were sort of proto-democracies in some respects, but the franchises were so limited that they couldn't really be thought of as democratic. They were clearly highly oligarchic constitutions. And my argument is that democracy as a political system became more widespread, more dominant, more complete through the 19th and early 20th centuries in what we now think of as the West, and later stretched to much of the world. And it followed the rise of the market economy, capitalism. And that, I suggest, there's a link. And the question is, why did it follow in this way? And I suggest, and I'm going to suggest this very briefly today, it did so because of the ideas associated with a market economy, with the as being the core institution in the economic sphere, and with the consequences of having such a market economy as it unfolded in the specific context of the 19th century, which of course was the Industrial Revolution. And I suggest there are three particular aspects at the level of ideology or ideas. The first is that as an economic system, this comes out very clearly in the 18th century literature on the market economy, it's a move from ascribed to achieved status. If you take the idea of a market economy seriously, your position in the economy and your success in the economy is supposed to follow from your ability as an entrepreneur, as a business person, the value of the personal assets you bring to the market. It's not about who your grandparents or great-grandparents were. It's no longer the world of aristocrats, or if it was, it corrodes the world of aristocrats. And indeed, of course, it did so. And that's a fundamentally egalitarian idea. It's the idea that every individual, of course, in the 19th century, clearly it was male individuals. So that's one of the big changes. I don't have time to go into that. But every individual has the chance to come from nothing, and many did, and many did in the late 18th and early 19th century in Britain, and thereafter came from nothing. There is the second underlying idea of capitalism, that people are entitled to engage freely in truck, barter, and exchange, a famous phrase. And that meant, of course, that individual choices have inherent value, that people's choices ought to guide the economy, and they have value in themselves if you want them to guide the economy, if you believe in that. And finally, the underlying idea of democratic citizenship has at least this in common with that, which is that it is the idea of individuals cooperating in areas where collective decision-making is necessary. And there are clearly always been many such areas. And one of the big debates in politics is how wide should be the arena of collective decision-making. But again, that means that individual choices have value. And these are clearly areas where, if you like, the ideology of the market and the ideology of the democratic polity coincide, because they both rest on this idea that what individuals choose to do, be it on their own or in acting concert with others through the political process, have value. And of course, capitalism ideologically has some quite important implications, as you all know very well, given your own history in the 19th century, and of course it's true elsewhere. It meant, in principle, free labor. It meant the end of serfdom and slavery. however contested those ends were. It also brought with it, though it took a long time and it was complicated, but it unambiguously brought with it, where it succeeded, vastly greater prosperity, unprecedented prosperity. I don't have time to go into that. I do in great detail in the book. It brought with it, because of the prosperity and the greater complexity of the economy, an immense push everywhere where it happened towards mass education, a desire that came from both the bottom and the top. Employers wanted educated people, people who could read plans. And it meant the rise with the industrial system of organized labor and the political demands of organized labor. And it meant the opportunity in societies that were getting richer for a positive sum form of politics, again, however contested, in which it was possible for politics to be able, or the society as a whole, and part of that, the political system, to provide people with a bit more every year, at least when the economy was growing. And all this was, as I'm sure everyone listening to this knows, essentially unprecedented. It hadn't happened before. And this chart just lays out one of about 60 charts in the book, but I think it's quite a fun chart. This comes from the Polity4 database, one of the better known databases, and a couple of databases on one aspect of capitalism, which is global capitalism, global trade, the integration of the world economy through trade. And the brown line shows democratization. It starts in 1870, when 10% of the polities, that's the right-hand side, 10% of all polities were democracies. Well, they weren't really, but at least had pretty wide franchises, and most of the characteristics we suggest. And the blue line shows the rise of the relationship of world trade to world GDP. So you can see a strong upswing in the proportion of the world's polities which were democratic, reaching a peak just after the First World War, with a lot of changes, of course, collapse of empires in Europe at that time, and a big rise in world trade, basically peaking in 1914. Then we got the 20s and 30s and 40s, which saw a collapse of both. I'm suggesting in my book that it's not simply one causing the other, they're both related. Illiberal societies and anti-democratic societies tend to go together. I should stress, of course, that this chart shows the situation for independent countries. And of course, the number of independent countries was vastly smaller at this time because of the colonial empires. Then in 1940, we have the war, that was the nadir, then a big recovery of democracy after the war with the victory of the Western Allies, reaching a peak in about 1960. Then a lot of the new countries became undemocratic, and this continued till the late 1980s when the Soviet Union fell. Then we have an enormous surge in both trade, the opening of the world economy, and the democratization process, which reached a peak in about 2000. And then I'm going to go on after that. So that's the long history, and I've summarized this incredibly briefly, but it seems to me, at least, and I argue at length why, there has an association with open economies and open societies and the relative success of democracy. Not in a simple way, but I think there is a link. There are also obviously tensions between democracy and the market economy, as I've described it. The first is pretty profound, that the natural tendency of the market economy is to go cross-border. In the 19th century, because of its unique location and scale and the resource potential at home, the US was a bit of an exception to that. It remained very closed. Most of the openness was to capital and people, big time, something I can't discuss in detail. But generally, for most countries, trade crosses borders. And so the market economy became a global economy, and Karl Marx was very good on that. Democracy, by its nature, is local. It's about people tied to and operating within the framework of institutions which are specific to a particular region and defined by that locality. It's about a territory, a state, political institutions, and the people who live within that. It is based, therefore, on a tie between a particular location and the people who live there. And it always has done. It wasn't different in this respect, at least for the Athenians. Democracy is, of course, also the domain of voice. It's about what Hirschman called voice, while capitalism is essentially about the opportunity for exit. The market allows you to leave, to stop buying what you don't want to buy, and if necessary, to stop providing your capital where you don't want to provide it, you go somewhere else at its limit. So these are very different relationships to influence and freedom of a different kind. Democracy, of course, rests on a fundamentally egalitarian ideal, that of the equality of citizens in their political persona. Of course, that's not real in actual democracies, but it's the core ideology. While capitalism doesn't rest on such an ideal, it may be egalitarian, the idea that anybody can enter it, but ultimately influence in the market depends on the resources you bring to bear and possess as a result of your activities. And of course, there are perverse outcomes possible from their interaction. If a democracy produces very perverse results in terms of who gains power, or the market economy fails to generate prosperity, collapses, disintegrates, or both happen together, you can have complete failure on both sides. In politics, demagogy, plutocracy, or autocracy are likely to emerge, and you can have economic collapses as well, or more plausibly, economic collapse will trigger political failures of this kind, and that, of course, is what happened in the interwar years in Europe. So if capitalism, democracy, as I suggested in my previous section, are basically a marriage of some kind, a sort of symbiosis, it is a difficult one, or one that operates in a tension. The tension is, I suggest in my book, a fundamental reality of our civilization as it is unfolded. And this tension is permanent. I think actually rather valuable, but it creates some really very big challenges. Now, let me go to my second section of this presentation on the recession of democratic capitalism. Now, a friend of mine, very well-known figure, Branko Milanovic, has recently written a book which I found very interesting, which is called Capitalism Alone. And he says essentially that while there's lots of debate about politics, some form of capitalism, some form of market system seems to have won everywhere, at least for the moment. The long history of debates between full socialism or some other economic system, but basically between full socialism and the market economy seems to be over, at least now. You only have to listen to Chinese officials talk about their economic system to understand that they sort of committed to this idea, whatever their view is of the role of the state within it. Essentially, they think market forces are a very, very good and powerful thing. And I once did at least at the rhetorical level, I once did a column about the two speeches given by President Trump and Xi Jinping in January 2017, and that was Mr. Trump's inaugural and Xi Jinping's very famous speech on globalization to the World Economic Forum, and Xi Jinping sounded much more like a free market capitalist than Donald Trump. That was rather a remarkable moment, and that's not just rhetoric in my view, though of course it's partly rhetoric. But while capitalism seems to have won, there seems quite a general move away from democracy with the rise of populism, pretty demagogic forms of populism. So I mean really demagogy in Plato's sense, what Viktor Orban calls a liberal democracy, which really isn't democracy at all, and autocracy. At this point, I have to stress, when I talk about democracy, I mean what Larry Diamond calls liberal democracy, which means democracy within the framework of a rule of law, which allows free formation of political parties, free assembly, which recognizes and protects the right to vote, which in other words is a genuinely open and contested system, but one which also protects the rights of minorities. So this is quite an elaborate version of democracy. I tend to the view that's really the only sort of version that has value and that is in the longer run likely to last. The rest, other versions, tend to collapse into something else fairly quickly. And we've seen that many times. We're seeing it in many emerging and developing countries at the moment. The rise of people like Erdogan, Modi, Duterte, Bolsonaro, Putin. I mean, these are autocrats wearing or would-be autocrats wearing the guise of democracy. They're not real. And of course, we've seen something a bit like that, in my view, in the US recently. Now, if we're thinking of countries being capitalists, it's worth stressing that the world's most important emerging economy and rising superpower has adopted what I call communist autocratic capitalism. Many other countries have succumbed to what I call demagogic autocratic capitalism. It's a very different flavor. The former is institutional, the latter is essentially personal. And I've indicated some of these personal autocratic capitalist models. And demagogic nationalism become increasingly potent even in core democracies, notably the US and UK. So these are the political systems that go within the context of broadly capitalist systems. This is from Freedom House, and it sort of indicates that in between 1998 and 1998, there was a very large rise in the proportion of countries that were free and partly free. And between 2000 and 2008, it wasn't massive. This started to go into reverse, and every subsequent year, Freedom House has got more upset about what's going on. So if I did the last couple of years, it will be worse still. This is an interesting chart, I think, on what the Freedom House thinks is the state of democracy in the major developed countries today. And it puts Canada, Australia, Japan right at the top, Germany, UK, France, and Italy in the middle, and I'm afraid it puts the US way behind the others, which is rather disturbing, since the US is obviously the world's most important democratic country and has been for a very long time, the guarantor, as it were, of the system. And its Freedom House is, after all, an American publication. Now, one of the great things that has happened in this period, and it's a very important aspect of the contest over democracy, is that we now have a huge superpower, which, while capitalist in some obvious sense, very highly integrated in the world economy, its political system is not only autocratic, institutionally, I've described as institutionally bureaucratic and autocratic. it's gained enormous power, and it is now, if you look at the big red block, towards the close, even in nominal GDP terms, it's basically as big as Europe or the United States. And under plausible assumptions, given that it's much bigger in population, growing much faster, this might stop. It's quite possible that over the next 20 years, 25 years, its economy will be as big as that of North America and Europe together. And if it's to retain the same model, it will be the most profound challenge for a democratic order, far greater, in my view, than the Soviet Union was. So that's one aspect to the recession of democratic capitalism, which is pretty important. Now, the third section I want to talk about is what's going on in the advanced countries. So previously I just talked about essentially about the world, and I'm suggesting that over the last half century or so, let's say since 1980, so last 40 years or so, economic changes in advanced countries have undermined the social and economic and political stability of our order by destabilizing essential elements in our society, and particularly the middle classes. And I'm just going to go very quickly through some aspects of that. The first is deindustrialization, the reversal of the industrial process, the process of industrialization, which create a very special form of social organization in which a very large number, proportion of the society who were not very highly educated, weren't college educated, enjoyed job stability, high incomes, a powerful social position, sufficient incomes to support families. This was an overwhelmingly male population, and their role in society has been fundamentally altered by ongoing and universal deindustrialization. Rising inequality, particularly important in the US and UK, a transformation of the population, which many people feel they weren't given a choice over, slowing productivity growth, so fundamental slowdown in the rate at which people overall were getting richer, which combined with rising inequality meant that for many people, they really weren't getting better off at all, and they ceased to believe they or their children would get better off. And then there came the shock of the financial crisis and the pandemic, this sense that things were seriously out of control, and a view that capitalism was rigged against them. In one way or another, ceasing to believe fundamentally in the economic system. And these changes have created severe anxiety, some of it status anxiety, especially, I argue, and I'm not original in this, among non-college educated men. And the cultural wars on which many focus, and with some reason, are in large part a reflection of these destabilizing economic changes. So I have, as you'd expect of me, a somewhat the economist view of the cultural and social stresses that we're seeing around us. I have a much longer discussion of that in the book, and I think these are interactive, but I think the economics plays, and I give long reasons for this, pretty fundamental part in what's been going on. So let me just go through some of this. This is the share of industry in civilian employment in the major developed countries, ranked by the share in 1970. It only goes up to 2015, but it continued to some degree thereafter. Basically, what you can see is that the proportion of people employed in industry with jobs of the characteristics I've described for non-college educated people has been declining decade by decade in all these countries. And the main reason is while the demand for manufacturing continues to, manufactured output continues to rise, it rises slowly in wealthy countries. In developing countries, they make it for themselves mostly. And productivity growth in this sector is very, very rapid. And I argue essentially that manufacturing is going the way of agriculture. At some point, nobody will work in a factory. There'll be all the work in factories will be done by robots. There is This is chart. I have lots of charts on changes in inequality. This is a very simple measure of inequality, the Gini coefficient, the Lorenz curve. And it just compares a lot of industrial countries, and you can see that US is out on its own among these countries. Also, it's out on its own in the increase in inequality on most measures. And the UK is also very, very high. And I suggest, not originally, that that's related to these social divisions we see. Now, this is really startling, I think. This is the average growth of output per hour in each decade for major developed countries going back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s. You can see that the last decade was a disaster. This is just before the pandemic. US also disaster, but it follows a long period of decline, except in the US, where the real collapse occurred between the 70s, 60s and the 70s, and was slow rise in productivity, and then yet another collapse after the financial crisis. But in all, in most countries, dramatically so, actually, in countries like Japan, Germany, Spain, the last 2 decades have been really miserable in terms of productivity growth. And that affects the average rise in real incomes, of course. Then you have the financial crisis. I think people haven't realized how significant that has been for output in our economies. So basically what I've done in this goes up to 2018. It shows the deviation of actual GDP per head from a continuation of the 1980 to 2007 trend. And if you look at it, basically it says Germany is the only country that is still roughly on its 1980 to 2007 trend. And the other economies, like the US and France, about 15 or 17% below trend by 2018. In Spain and Italy, 25% below trend. The UK, more than 20% below trend. The financial crisis ex post was an enormous economic disaster with very long-running consequences. It was a fundamental break in trend, and that fits also with the productivity data I've shown you. So what I'm suggesting is quite a lot, and I've got vastly more, but quite a lot has gone wrong economically after the 80s. In the long run, that was first slowly and then quite quickly the financial crisis, which I think destabilized people's confidence in the system. Now, let me just end and go. No, I'm going on a little bit too long. So what do we need to do to renew democracy and renew capitalism? Well, renewing democracy, I think the core idea I've got a lot of discussion of this. I'm not sure I've got the full answer, but it seems to me one has to strengthen the idea of citizenship, which must mean that in addition to all the things one fights over properly and appropriately in democracy, there have to be some things we agree we all share, that we all have in common, some set of allegiances to a common home, to common values, at least the rules of the game of democracy, but ideally more, that must be shared, some version of truth, some forms of debate. If we don't have that, we don't have anything. We cannot actually keep a democratic community together. So it must be division within a powerfully shared sense of mutuality. And that has to be rebuilt, I argue, in our economics and our politics. We need to renew governance by re-establishing the legitimacy of the idea of competence through some forms of rethinking the way we regulate the market, through re-establishing effective localism. That's particularly important in countries like my own, more so I think than yours. And at the same time, inescapably cementing this refurbished local democracy, national democracy within a global context, because we have become so aware of our global interdependence. And that's why the political challenges we face are so deep and profound. We have to strengthen our sense of a common local citizenship while also making global government work. And I don't think we know how to do this when I discuss this at length. And we need to think about democratic accountability, the way elections work, the way parties work, the way parties are financed, and the role of money in politics, and the way we bring citizens into the political process. I've been very influenced by, this may be unworkable in your context, but the Irish model of citizens' assemblies, of bringing people in together to discuss and recommend changes in contested issues. In their case, the most dramatic example was abortion. That seems to me the sort of way one wants to go. And of course, a lot of this is what the Swiss do. And finally, as Jonathan mentioned, there are core issues about the media. How do we recreate some idea of the public interest, of truth? How do we regulate social media? And in my book, I emphasize very strongly, since we've got something like the BBC, we've got to keep it. Then in capitalism, what I tend to do is go back. What I've done is go back to FDR's great speech on the Four Freedoms of January 1941 and look at what he talked about. And what he talked about, which I thought was still quite relevant. And we just need to renew equality of opportunity and the ideology and reality of it. Jobs for those who can work. So we need higher employment. That's an absolutely essential thing, but the jobs need to be good jobs. So you have to think about minimum wages, wage subsidies, training, active labor markets, all that sort of thing. You need a safety net. People cannot bear, in my view, beyond a certain extent, radical insecurity. Every democratic polity has moved towards a welfare state in the last 100 years. I think it's inescapable that that has happened. You can't have democracy without that. What the state can provide is simply too important for people who essentially have no assets of their own at all. So you need a fully fledged welfare state, and you need to control the exploitation of extraordinary special privileges with respect to wealth, taxation, behavior of very, very powerful institutions and individuals within the marketplace. These are not ideas I would have had 20, 25 years ago, but it now seems to be pretty clear we have to go there. And I think of this even in the context of climate change, we have to have a rising, widely shared and sustainable standard of living. I don't believe in degrowth. I don't think it's possible to sell that as a democratic proposition. And that means that our solutions to these huge questions of sustainability are unavoidably going to be technocratic. And we have to fit technocratic competence into this sort of framework. So my conclusion is, I think we are in a world in quite profound upheaval politically, both in terms of international relations, the rise of China, the rise of autocracy in many parts of the world, and the destabilization of our own system. Global capitalism historically promoted democracy in a big shift in global power, but it also promoted massive shocks inside high-income countries, including a financial crisis, lots of other things. And the challenge now is to protect democracy from an out-of-control populism. Demagogy is a better term. Adjust to the rise of China and manage the global commons all simultaneously. And that will require, in my view, renewing both democracy and capitalism at home and globally. It's going to be an immensely difficult challenge. And all I've done here is just highlight a few points about how I'm thinking about it. Thank you for listening.
Martin, thank you so much for a really wonderful talk. I'd like to now introduce our faculty who are going to join in the conversation. Marianne Bertrand is the Chris Dialynis Distinguished Service Professor of Economics at the Booth School of Business. She's faculty director of the Rustandi Center for Social Sector Innovation, and she's also faculty director of the Inclusive Economy Lab at the Urban Labs. And Elizabeth Chatterjee is assistant professor of environmental history, and she focuses on the histories of energy and infrastructure. And her first book, Electric Democracy, will provide an energy-centered history of India's transforming political economy since independence in 1947. And Jonathan Levy is a professor of US history. His most recent book is Ages of American Capitalism, a history of the United States. That's an account of American economic life from the British colonial settlement through the Great Recession. And Kenneth Pomerantz is a university professor of modern Chinese history, and his research is mostly in social, economic, and environmental history, though it also deals with state formation, imperialism, religion, and gender. He's the author and editor of many books, including The Great Divergence, China, Europe, and the Making of Modern World History, Modern World Economy, excuse me. And then Gabriel Winant is an assistant professor of US history, specializing in the social structures of inequality in modern American capitalism. And his first book, The Next Shift, The Fall of Manufacturing and the Rise of Healthcare in the Rust Belt America, it's just been published. So welcome all of you. And let me, just because Marianne's last name begins with B, I think we'll just, on that sort of principle, I'll ask Marianne, could you start us off? What I hope is we'll have an open conversation. People who want to join in will let me know. But Marianne, maybe you could begin the conversation.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks, Martin, for a really fascinating lecture. I guess so I'm an economist by training. I think there's just a lot of diversity on this panel, which is why I'm really excited about it. A couple of thoughts kind of came through my mind as I was listening to you. One is that I feel like the changes that you describe in terms of like how capitalism works, the rise in income inequality, the decline of labor share, the increase in product market concentration, and then the increase in markups and rents, all of these have been going on for quite a long time. We're probably talking about like 40 years, go back to like the Reagan years and the Thatcher years, again, thinking for now about the US and the UK. And so this has been going on for a really long time. And to me, this is striking in light of when the retreat of democracy seems to have been happening, which is a much more recent phenomenon. And maybe we're not talking about the same thing, but when I think about the retreat of democracies, I'm talking about Trump, I'm talking about Bolsonaro, I'm talking about Boris Johnson and people like that. So how do you think about that? And of course, you put a little emphasis on the financial crisis, but why do you view it as such an important moment? And again, kind of maybe, arguing against, kind of this moment as being so important, if I were to just run a regression and look at, kind of which countries have seen more of a retreat of democracy over the last 10 years, I'm not sure that what would clearly emerge is that it is those countries that have suffered the most during the financial crisis. That's just one first comment. The other thought I had, kind of when listening to you, and again, thinking back about what I think for me is a much more kind of recent phenomenon in terms of the retreat of the democracy, is that except for bullet point, there was little discussion of the media. And, Jonathan started us there, kind of you are a journalist. And I wondered whether this was, kind of a choice, because you do not believe that what's happening in terms of ownership of media, the rise of social media, the huge amount of like penetration of, things like WhatsApp in a lot of countries, because you don't view it as important, or because it's not really just the focus of the book in terms of, again, what's explaining what's happening with the retreat of democracy. So I'll stop with this for now.
Martin, do you want to?
Okay, because you've got so many discussants, then I'm going to be very, very, very brief, very unfair, because those questions could easily take us an hour all on their own. And of course, Marianne will understand that I've given the most stripped down possible version. But broadly, this is how I think about this. And I'm not saying I'm right. I'm on the first one. we moved in many countries, not all, into a zone of fragility. A situation in which you're not terribly healthy, rather like a person might not be terribly healthy, but actually that person might not be terribly healthy and go on not being terribly healthy for a long time before finally he or she drops dead. Well, somebody else might, often because we don't really understand, have a heart attack and die. So I think we've been in and that's why I use the Hemingway quote, we've been increasingly in a zone of fragility for quite a long time. It just was not something we really noticed. There are an enormous number of sets of changes that went with that in societies. And I do think that certainly in the US and UK, the financial crisis was a very big deal. I'm not sure that's true elsewhere. I think it was also in Italy, by the way, and that's been concealed. I won't go into that and also Spain. And the reason for that is not only were the last 10 years far worse than anything before it in terms of the, in Britain, for example, we had far and away the longest period of stagnant real incomes, as far as one can see, for 100 years after it. But what was also, I think, really important in both cases is that it showed that the ruling elites in both the financial and business sectors and the governance sectors, in the most dramatic fashion, didn't have a clue. It simply destroyed their legitimacy. I think that was particularly powerful myself in the US and UK because their claim to legitimacy rested very significantly on the idea that they knew how to run a market economy. I think that was very, very significant. I think that many other Western countries, by no means all, are in this zone of fragility for pretty obvious reasons, historically, Germany and Japan least. And that we remain in this zone of fragility. On the media, I can't make up my mind, although I have written about it in the book, of course. A lot of the politics of demagoguery that we've seen, the sorts of language, the sorts of figures that are emerging are quite familiar from the past, broadly speaking, and the sorts of lies about and condemnation of immigrants, minorities, all the rest of it, again, are very familiar from the past. Obviously, there have been very important political institutional changes too, with the decline of mass parties, the decline and the rise of the modern media as an alternative way of mobilizing people. And I think those differences are very, very important. They're obviously important, but I think the underlying conditions of the economy and society are what makes people susceptible to these sorts of media stories. So I feel the media are in significant measure, I'm not saying more than that, providing politicians and people with the sort of stories they want to hear in this situation in exactly the same way, though of course in completely different technologically, as the fascists managed to do quite well with their technologies in the 20s and 30s. So to me, the continuity is more obvious than what is new, but I don't deny that there are some very new elements in it, and that makes our thinking about what you can do about this rather different.
Thank you. Anybody want to follow up on that, or John, please?
Okay. Yeah, to follow up on this thread. So, if I'm following correctly, the trends have been going on for 40 years. We should have known in 2008, but instead, the surprise really came with Trump and Brexit in 2016 that things had really gone awry. And I guess I just wanted to ask you, since you had mentioned in the talk that your views were quite different on a lot of these subjects 20, 25 years ago, what was it like, or what was the process in which you kind of changed your mind? Since you said we were talking before your lecture that you were actually writing this book before Trump and Brexit. You'd already kind of ended up in a doom and gloom place before 2016. So given that you are a journalist, you do write in real time. Not all figures who write in the public square are willing to change their views or change their minds. So I asked this from a place of admiration as opposed to a kind of gotcha question. But what was it like, and when was there a moment when, or what was the process through which you began to kind of change your views and think of these questions in terms of crisis?
That I can answer fairly quickly, but I also can tell you what the core thing is that I've changed on. So the first was the financial crisis. I was pretty nervous. I wrote a lot of columns in the 8 years before the financial crisis about international macroeconomic instability and possible problems that might emerge from that. But what happened in the financial crisis surprised me. And because of its scale. I mean, it was an absolutely enormous event. I think a lot of people who didn't follow it quite as closely as I did, and I wrote a whole book on this, haven't realized how massive it was because of the scale of the rescue, which is essentially unprecedented. I didn't think that it was possible for the financial system of the Western world essentially to cease to exist for some period. More or less what happened. And then following that, it began to become obvious that fundamental assumptions I had about the universal commitment of our politicians and our people to democratic values was wrong. And that came out of the world's value surveys. It began to become very clearly from my friends who worked on the World Value Surveys, showed very, very clearly that in successive generations, particularly with the younger generation, the commitment to democratic values was being de-anchored, or whatever the word would be, and that was obvious even before these phenomena emerged. And so I said to myself, look, I hadn't believed these two things were likely, and so there were two changes that became obvious. The classic Marxist critique of the financial sector and its proneness to crisis was obviously in some profound sense correct. I mean, core country financial crisis of this kind hadn't occurred for 80 years. And secondly, I began to think that this very famous Karl Polanyi view that people really couldn't live, they couldn't ultimately live with a completely free market world. And if that's what they were given, they would seek security in whatever way possible, tribal, not necessarily rationally, not necessarily instrumentally social democrat or any of that, but in some way that gave them validation and a sense of security in a larger movement. And that seemed to me what was going on. So this changed my view, and I realized, to put it very, very crudely, I had been far too complacent. I think I was in fairly good company in that regard. And if you're going to go on, I mean, in that situation, I faced a very simple choice. I could have done one or two. I thought about it quite seriously, though probably would never do. I mean, you either retire and go and cultivate your garden, or you say, I was wrong, and this is what I now believe. So I decided, cowardly perhaps, but since I enjoy my life, that I'd rather do the latter. And I was certainly not going to go on, as many people, of course, do, and pretend that, spend the rest of my life showing why I'd always been right and nothing that I had believed had ever been wrong. That I thought would be just ludicrous. So that's where I've ended up. I feel quite comfortable with that. Now, I'm sorry this has gone on for too long, but this is what I've said, and I've written about this many times, particularly when I got another award in America, the Loeb Award. I said, look, this is the way I think about me, many other people in my job. I have certain core values, which are rather naive, simple-minded core values. I sort of believe in Enlightenment ideas. I believe in democracy. I like the idea of markets. My opinions on how they work in any particular moment and what you should do to manage them, given that we are in a fallen world in which everything is about compromise, everything is about adjusting systems that are always in tension. Well, what you have to do to make them work, they change, or at least you have to change your minds about them if it turns out you're wrong. I think I have decided that in order to defend my core values, which I've indicated in all their confusion and complexity, I've had to change my opinions about how the world works and how we should run it, or try to run it. That's why I have ended up where I am. I don't mind being made feeling that I'm a fool. I think it's better to recognize that one's been a fool than to pretend one hasn't.
Ken, do you want to join in? You got to unmute.
Yeah, and I wanted to pick up on the last thing that Martin just said, which was to talk about the importance of changing one's mind. Because it does seem to me one of the things that was sort of hinted at around the edges of your presentation, but never really confronted, was the necessity of deliberation, right? That it's not just aggregating people's opinions that makes a democracy. It's having some mechanism through which they can be changed by rational discussion. And that leads me back in a way to where Marianne was, which was asking you to talk a little bit more about media, and specifically social media. Right. I mean, the idea that we now live in what one Microsoft executive called a world of continuous partial attention strikes me as a very, very profound change of the last, let's say, 25 years. And one that I think we have to find some new way of wrestling with, but I have no clue what it is, because I don't see how you have real deliberation in a world in which such a high percentage of political communication is, you know, the tweet and the Facebook post.
Well, first of all, one of the reasons I haven't gone further is I have no idea what the solution to this is, but I feel I'm in very good company because I've read quite a lot of, I'm interested in the media, so I read lots of stuff about this, and I don't feel anyone else is. So let me I did discuss one point, which is this idea of the deliberative assembly, which I think is quite an interesting one. I think we could have done, within the context of a referendum campaign like ours, we could have set up the way we were debating among ourselves, because people were paying attention in a more systematic and organized way than we did. And it might conceivably have had better results. I have been thinking that the permanent referendum, the constant referendum, seems to work rather well with the Swiss. And seems to be sort of built into the way they think about public life and their engagement, and they seem on the whole to make moderately sensible decisions, at least not crazy ones. But so those are ideas I've also discussed. But on the really big point, and I don't know my answer, so I'm going to be weasel here. How did it used to work, it seems to me, in my childhood, particularly in a country like Britain? We had a broadly defined technocracy, quite moderately competent, beyond politics, included business and so forth. The people at large basically expecting them to get on with it. They didn't get very excited with politics. They did have some very important institutional mechanisms, very important point for incorporation into the political sphere, of which I think the most important in our case were the trades unions. And I think that's true for many other countries. It brought a lot of people into the political sphere directly or indirectly. And that was quite real. People were clearly far more engaged in civic associations, as far as I can read it, in America and Britain in those years. But at core, things were going fairly well most of the time. And the the technocracy was expected to get on with it. Now, what's happened, of course, it seems to me, it's a twofer thing. Both things have happened. And what I call the technocracy, the broadly defined policy-making elite and business elite, has lost the trust of the public in large measure for very good reason, and the suspicion that results is immensely supercharged by our media and the ability of skillful demagogues, who are not a new phenomenon in any way, to exploit these media to mobilize people en masse. So those two things have gone together. I have no idea how to fix the latter. I really don't see how. When I'm optimistic, I say, well, it took us several centuries to sort out what to do with the printing press, and probably take us several centuries to sort out what we got to do with this. But I do think, and that is where I feel more comfortable, that actually having moderately competent technocrats who actually have some vague idea what they're trying to do might at least be a start. And there is a possibility of that if you're lucky, and you've got to try that way. But on the fundamental issue, how you recreate some sort of working way of engagement between what is an enormous electorate, very diverse, with our political process in the modern circumstances, how you make democracy really work. I haven't read anything. I've read a lot of literature on this, by the way, in this. It's all new to me, some of it very interesting, but none of it seems to me clearly convincing. That's my perception. So your question is the right one.
Please, Liz.
Yeah, just following up on that, and thanks, this has been so interesting. And sources of trust. Well, firstly, just an observation, which is that it's very striking that the US and UK ended up in the same place with very different political problems, you know, extreme polarization in the US and almost like cartel parties that resembled each other very strongly in the UK. Yet we get to the same point with technocracy. My question is about alternate sources of trust. And I was very interested in your flagging the role of patriotism as possibly undergirding revitalized citizenship. And, you know, we look at, say, countries that have done well on COVID, they seem to have this shared high level of trust in experts, including, say, Japan, where the economy has been very badly handled, or at least, you know, not done well for a long time. And what they also seem to share is this homogenization, right? This ethnic homogeneity. I wanted to push you then on this question of patriotism. How do we incorporate into a set of shared values and practices remaining open, for example, to migration? Or is this something that we just have to sacrifice in order to save the democratic part of this democratic capitalist compact?
I suppose, like most outsiders, so European countries have a fascinatingly different history, since for most of them, the phenomenon of becoming so visibly ethnically diverse is a relatively recent one. I discussed that. I mean, it's an extraordinarily recent one, less so in the UK, but elsewhere, also less so in France, but even so, it's entirely post-war. You know, one can, of course, immediately respond quite rightly that's because they exported themselves to the whole world and took it over. So the diversity, as it were, was where they were ruling. I'm not going to go into that whole story because that's very important. But I suppose when I first went to the US, which was in the 60s, when I was, of course, the race riots and the whole rest of it, I sort of had this feeling, here's an ethnically diverse country, which has created a story for itself of being Americans, and that everybody shared. And I was actually bowled over by the amount of visible patriotism in America in the 60s. This was 66, so before the Vietnam War really blew everything apart. And the obvious exception, it was completely obvious, were African Americans. But one felt that the civil rights movement, I was an optimistic, was going to fix that. So certainly by now, and therefore that the Americans had found a story. You need a story. That's the core of it. You need a story about what being something is, which you can all buy into, or at least most of you can buy into. That story needs something to do with this land, but it also has to do with its history, its values. It's becoming better, more open, more inclusive. And I've always felt that if the core values of this system are democratic and liberal, i.e. they're about people pursuing their own lives, about freedom, core freedoms, about participating in the political process, this is a story you ought to be able to tell. If everybody feels reasonably comfortable and everybody feels that they too are going to have a chance, that it's quite widely shared. That's the sort of story, it seems to me, a country needs to have about itself, to have political processes in which the essential point is you don't feel your opponents are the enemy. They're just the opposition. I have a lot of discussion in this about this strange idea of the loyal opposition. It does seem to be pretty obvious that those ideas have weakened dramatically. But it seems to me the only way you can make a diverse society operate, and we are a diverse society, so that can't be changed, and we will almost certainly get more diverse, is by creating a story which almost everybody can buy into. And so you can differ with people passionately, but it's not life and death. If it's life and death, then democracy will collapse. It becomes civil war. And we've clearly moved a long way from that. I think the US probably furthest, and it's most difficult because it's so huge, so diverse, and all the rest of it. I do think, and this is where I will be savage from the left, that showing that you do control immigration is part of that. Because it is, but it's only a small part of it. The core of it is having this story. I do think that we've lost that story. And part of the reason we've lost that story, going back to the question raised by Marianne, is I think that we can't tell the story of shared prosperity. And the shared prosperity story, in my view, and this is where I think the Europeans and the Americans are the same, was a very big part of why the post-war settlement worked. You have to have that story as part of this for our sort of societies to make people feel that they're part of what is on offer. They're included in this. And if they feel that they're not, then it starts getting very bitter. But this is difficult. This is really difficult, and I don't know whether we can solve it. But I have become reasonably convinced that we face really quite deep challenges in sustaining a sense of commonality which overrides our sense of difference.
Gabriel, do you want to join in now?
Sure, thank you. I'd like to ask a question about age structure and generations. Many of the wealthier societies that we've been talking about are becoming increasingly aged in their demographic structure. And you mentioned earlier, and I remember being struck by this at the time, the World Values Survey finding that younger generations seem to avow weaker commitment to liberal democracy. But the political constituency for political authoritarianisms generally reveal the reverse in electoral behavior, which is to say, Trump and Johnson and so on, right, largely have drawn their base for older generations. So I'm curious how you make sense of that and whether we might draw a connection, or how you would draw a connection to the politics of immigration, as Liz was just talking about, in terms of the increasingly foreign-born younger workforce that is working in many of these kind of low productivity service jobs that these older generations perhaps need to employ.
Yeah, I think I don't probably, certainly in my book, discuss enough about the age dimension of this, because it is so multifaceted. So we don't have infinite amount of time. In fact, we're pretty well at the end. So I think it's pretty clear that if at least if you look at those polls, that the dominant thrust from the younger generation is to demand quite deep social and economic change. In most of these results, so if you look at Britain, for example, the overwhelming dominant source of support for Corbyn was younger voters. It was, well, at least they were perhaps more accurately say, the people who voted most intensely for him were younger voters. And the older voters voted the other side. Now, I don't particularly I don't know whether Corbyn ultimately can be seen as a democratic force or not. That's a nice debate to have. But that was, I think, the core polarization there was partly values, pretty obvious, but a lot of it was economics. The older generation is clinging on to what it has, and the younger generation wants really quite deep economic and social change. So that's to me is in a very profound way economics. But there's another aspect of what's going on, which I have been trying to think about, and this is an aspect of the culture war, which I suspect is very important, but I don't quite know how to fit it in. Intelligent people might do better, which is simply that the older generation, my generation, so when I went to university in the Middle Ages, as it were, 5% of British people went to university. So in my generation, essentially nobody went to university. And the people who did were a tiny elite who'd been running society or mismanaging it ever since. In the generation now 18 to 30, the proportion is 45. And so their view of the world is shaped in a very profound way by the ideas they got from a university education, which makes them separate from, it divides the younger generation itself very profoundly, because it's 50% has no economic future, essentially, and 50% has some sort of future. But it also divides them from the older generations. And I think that shows itself in different attitudes to cosmopolitanism, broadly defined. They're a more cosmopolitan generation for this reason. And finally, of course, when we went, our lives consisted of basically getting richer most of the time, particularly if you're in your 60s or 70s, and their lives have consisted of complete stagnation. So this, I think, shapes generational attitudes, but I think it shapes generational attitudes, as far as I can see, in very, very complicated ways. But the most important way, as far as I can see, is that the younger generation is generally far to the left of the old generation. Whether it's more democratic, I'm not sure. That depends on really how you think of what you think of as democratic. But it is striking that the age gradient in political attitudes in our society seems to be quite profound.
Ken, your finger's up. Yeah, please continue.
I wanted to continue the thread that, that Martin started, of course, but that Liz picked up on, with this question about how patriotism both might be part of what we need, but also might be a problem. And I want to move it away from immigration to a subject we haven't talked about really at all, which is international politics. I mean, I was struck that in your discussion of the collapse of the legitimacy of the old elite, Iraq, for instance, just didn't figure, which I think, at least in the US and the UK, is a non-trivial part of the story. I also think, again, at least in the US, the end of the Cold War was a non-trivial contributor to the kind of radicalization of the American right, which felt that they could go much, much further in demonizing the state than they had been able to before. I mean, think of the rise of Newt Gingrich, for instance, in the early 90s. And then I also wanted to bring up the example of two countries where not only have they done moderately well in technocratic terms in recent years, despite having the same economic woes as the rest of us, but where democracy is, if anything, livelier than it was a decade ago, which are Taiwan and South Korea. I'm not sure if that's a good sign because it shows, look, it can be done, or if it's a grim sign because what they share is the presence in their politics of a looming enemy that creates a certain kind of solidarity. And certainly if we want our democratic politics to cope with global issues like climate change, basing it on a looming enemy across the border isn't going to do it for us.
Well, I think briefly, these are all very good questions. I don't discuss this in great detail. I really wasn't trying to provide a world history of the last century or two, because that would be insane. And I tried to stick to the things I felt I knew a bit about. But it is obvious that serial incompetence affects people's view of their elite. I mean, my perspective on America, Britain is slightly different because these have been less central events. I mean, to me, the most egregious example of serial incompetence in foreign policy was Vietnam. And somehow America seemed to have recovered from that. I would be interested in American views of whether Iraq did more damage to their credibility of their elite than Vietnam. My own view would tend to be, but this is an outsider's, that the answer is less so. First point, but these are important questions. The bigger point you raise is part of what I said, which is, and I've written about this in columns, that one way to make patriotism work, and I think that's particularly important in a highly diverse society, is to have a common enemy. And so I think the Cold War was a great help for Western democracy, legitimized it. It made clear who you were opposing. It brought everybody together. And it seems to be pretty clear that the United States is it has girded itself for doing the same with China. This is now, I think, baked in the cake. And I think that is also true. Certainly, it's part of the Korea and Taiwan story. I know both these countries, but of course, there are other factors that unite them in ethnically, but also a common recent. I mean, Korea and Taiwan have been economically, at least over the longer term, last 60, so sensationally successful. People are so aware of that. They're so aware of the fragility of it, and their democracy is so new and so not taken for granted that I think one has to my reaction on that will be to say they still have an enormous amount of capital, social and political capital from their past successes to draw on, quite apart from this shared enemy. But I do think on the bigger point you raise, one way we are likely to go is through what's called the new Cold War, and whatever it may be, uniting ourselves in opposition to a common enemy. And that's clearly where we're going to go. The problem with that strategy for uniting us, for recreating patriotism or whatever you call it, is that it will make absolutely impossible, in my view, dealing with any of the global commons problems we confront. So it's a solution, if you can call it a solution, which is, to me, worse than the disease. Or at least it has to be handled with unbelievable care if we're to avoid blowing ourselves up. A Cold War with China is, to my mind, a completely different proposition from one with the Soviet Union. And by the way, I'm not making this statement trying to suggest that China and the Soviet Union are the same thing in any case. But I think you've raised some very interesting questions about why there's been this loss of confidence in elites, and there are so many dimensions of that. you know, I think we've lost confidence in our elites because they don't deserve confidence, to put it bluntly. And I'm part of that problem, though I think not quite as big as some others. But there is a real danger that they will try to restore, what does the Biden administration and the Trump administration share? The one thing they genuinely share is that China is the enemy.
Mhm.
In fact, this administration has a much more comprehensive view of China as the enemy than Trump did, because Trump's view of all this sort of thing was very superficial and transactional.
Martin, I'm very grateful. I'm also very mindful of the time it is in London. So just thank you so much for your talk and for joining us in discussion. Gabriel, Ken, John, Marianne, Liz, I mean, just thank you so much for joining us and what was, a real conversation. And on the one hand, I regret that it's time to go, but on the other hand, it's nice to end a party while everybody's still having a good time. Martin, again, thank you so much for joining us today, and good night to everybody, and good night.
Thank you so much.